Hello, and welcome to Day by Day True Crime Stories, the podcast where we explore a different crime or justice milestone from this day in history. I'm your host, Kona Gallagher, and today is March 7th. On this day in 1965, what was supposed to be a peaceful march for voting rights turned into one of the most shocking acts of brutality in the civil rights movement. Hundreds of men, women, and children set out from Selma, Alabama, marching toward Montgomery to demand the right to vote. But before they could even leave Selma, they were met with violence on a day that is now known as Bloody Sunday. This wasn't just an attack on protesters, it was an attack on democracy itself. And when the world saw what happened that day, everything changed. Today, we'll talk about what happened and what this day meant. Not just for Selma, but for America. Let's get started. By the 1960s, Black Americans had the legal right to vote, but in the South, Jim Crow laws made it nearly impossible. In Selma, Alabama, voter suppression wasn't just a problem, it was a way of life. There were rigged literacy tests that Black residents were forced to take to prove that they could vote. They were also charged poll taxes, which were fees just to register. And even those who did all of that and tried to register often faced threats, job loss, or worse. All of this led to the fact that despite making up more than half of Selma's population, less than 2% of Black residents were registered to vote. This injustice led to organized resistance. The Dallas County Voters League, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, and Dr. Martin Luther King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, all joined forces. But change didn't come easy. And in February 1965, everything boiled over. On February 26, 1965, during a peaceful protest in Marion, Alabama, a young activist named Jimmy Lee Jackson was beaten and shot in the stomach by Alabama state troopers. He died 8 days later from his injuries. Jimmy wasn't a criminal. He wasn't violent. He was just a young man who was fighting for his family's right to vote. And his murder was the final straw. To honor Jimmy Lee Jackson's memory, activists decided to march from Selma to Montgomery to demand change. On Sunday, March 7, 1965, around 600 men, women, and children gathered at Brown Chapel AME Church in Selma. And these were just ordinary people. They were factory workers, students, parents, grandparents, but they all had the same goal: to march 54 miles to Montgomery and demand their right to vote. At the front of the march were two men, 25-year-old John Lewis, a leader with SNCC, and Reverend Hosea Williams, a senior member of the SCLC. They walked in silence, knowing the risks but refusing to be afraid. Their first challenge? Crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge. As they reached the top of the bridge, they saw it. A wall of Alabama state troopers and sheriff's deputies blocking their path. The officers were armed with clubs, whips, tear gas, and some were even on horseback. Major John Cloud, the commanding officer, made an announcement over the bullhorn. Quote, "This is an unlawful assembly. You have 2 minutes to disperse." End quote. The marchers didn't move. John Lewis later recalled, quote, "We were kneeling to pray, and before we could even finish, they attacked." End quote. Without warning, Major Cloud shouted, quote, "Troopers, advance." And then it was chaos. Officers charged with clubs, swinging at men, women, and even children. Tear gas filled the air, burning eyes and choking those who tried to escape. Police on horseback trampled people as they desperately tried to flee. One marcher later said, quote, "I saw people getting hit so hard their feet left the ground." End quote. Among the victims were John Lewis, who was beaten so severely that his skull was fractured. Amelia Boynton Robinson, a longtime activist, was knocked unconscious and was left lying on the bridge. In all, more than 50 marchers were hospitalized, while countless others also suffered injuries. In less than 10 minutes, the peaceful march had turned into a bloodbath. What the Alabama troopers didn't realize was that TV cameras were rolling. That night, millions of Americans turned on their televisions and saw men and women being beaten unconscious, peaceful protesters being attacked for simply walking, and Black citizens brutalized for demanding their constitutional rights. Americans who had ignored the civil rights movement up to that point could no longer look away. Even President Lyndon B. Johnson was shaken. Just days later, he stood before Congress and declared, quote, "Their cause must be our cause too, and we shall overcome," end quote. Those words signaled that real change was coming. Despite the horror of Bloody Sunday, the marchers refused to give up. On March 9th, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. led a second march, but turned back to avoid more bloodshed. Then, on March 21st, under federal protection, thousands of marchers finally made it to Montgomery. And on August 6, 1965, their struggle paid off. The Voting Rights Act was signed into law, banning literacy tests, poll taxes, and any racial discrimination in voting. The sacrifices of the Selma marchers helped change history. Today is the 60th anniversary of this historic march, and the images of Bloody Sunday still haunt us. The marchers of Selma didn't just change one law, they changed a nation. But their work isn't finished. Even today, voting rights are still under attack in some parts of the country. So as we remember Bloody Sunday, we also ask, what are we doing to protect the rights that they fought for? Because history only matters if we learn from it. Thank you for joining me on today's episode of Day by Day True Crime Stories. If you found this story compelling, please subscribe, rate, and review us on your favorite podcast platform. And be sure to join me again tomorrow as we explore another significant event in true crime history. Until then, stay safe and remember that behind every headline is a life worth remembering. Day by Day, True Crime Stories is a Little Monster production.
Hey, you can do it!